I want you to just imagine an unfathomably large number for a second.
Okay, I'm ready.
So in the year 2025, the world bought $3 trillion worth of oil.
Yeah, that's a staggering amount of wealth.
Right. But the craziest part of that transaction isn't even the oil itself. It's the fact that virtually every single drop of that $3 trillion was purchased using one single mandatory currency.
Which is, it presents a really fascinating paradox when you think about it.
How so?
Well, if you were to ask, just a passing economist why one single currency completely dominates the entire global energy market, their instinctive textbook answer would probably be about stability.
Like it's just the strongest currency, so everyone uses it.
Exactly. They might argue it's the undisputed champion of the free market, or maybe that it's backed by the strongest physical assets on Earth.
Yeah.
But looking through the massive stack of historical archives, declassified memos, and the recent energy market data we have for this deep dive, the actual answer has absolutely nothing to do with free market supremacy.
Not even a little bit. It actually has to do with a covert, literal handshake agreement struck in a sweltering Saudi Arabian desert back in 1974.
Yeah, it really does.
So today, our mission for this deep dive is to completely deconstruct this system. We are talking about the petrodollar.
The most powerful financial system that, honestly, no one ever really taught you about.
Right. We need to explore exactly how it was built, how it acts as this invisible engine driving the everyday purchasing power of the money sitting in your bank account right now, and the profound geopolitical lengths gone to over the decades to protect it.
And we're also going to get into why a very weird combination of electric vehicles and global currency rebellions might finally be breaking its grip.
I definitely want to dig into the electric vehicle data because that blew my mind. But before we get to EVs, I need you to explain the foundational crisis.
Right, the origin story.
Because none of this $3 trillion monopoly makes any sense unless we travel back to 1971. We need to talk about the day the global financial system essentially had the floorboards ripped out from under it.
Yeah, to understand the birth of the petrodollar, you really have to understand the violent death of the gold standard.
Okay, set the stage for us.
So let's look at the post-World War II global economy. It was built on a framework known as the Bretton Woods system.
Right.
Under this arrangement, the United States dollar served as the anchor for global trade. And the dollar itself was explicitly backed by physical gold held in American vaults.
Let me stop you there for a second because backed by gold is one of those phrases people throw around in history classes, but they never really explain the actual mechanism.
Yeah, it becomes a bit of a buzzword.
What did that functionally mean for, say, a foreign government holding American paper money?
So mechanically, it meant guaranteed physical convertibility. If the Central Bank of France or Great Britain held U.S. dollars, they could literally load those paper bills onto a ship, sail to the United States, hand them over to the Treasury, and demand the equivalent value in physical gold bullion.
Wait, literally, they could just show up and swap paper for gold?
Literally. At the time, the rate was fixed at $35 an ounce. So you weren't holding a theoretical unit of value, you were holding a literal receipt for a finite, tangible asset.
Okay, but looking at the historical ledgers from the 1960s, America was walking into a massive mathematical trap.
Oh, absolutely. A huge trap.
Because you have the Vietnam War, you have massive Cold War defense spending, and the rollout of incredibly expensive domestic initiatives like the Great Society programs.
Yeah, the spending was just astronomical.
And to fund all of this, the U.S. government was doing what governments basically always do when they need capital quickly. They were running the printing presses.
Right. And this introduces a critical economic mechanism called Triffin's dilemma.
Triffin's dilemma. Okay, break that down for me.
It's the core paradox of being the world's reserve currency. On one hand, to supply the world with enough dollars to facilitate global trade, the United States had to run massive deficits and pump cash into the international system.
Because everyone needed dollars to trade with each other.
Exactly. But on the other hand, by pumping all those paper dollars into the world, they were printing vastly more claims on gold than they actually had physical gold in their vaults.
Oh, wow. So it's essentially a fractional reserve banking system, but on a sovereign global scale.
Precisely.
But that only works as long as nobody actually asks for the gold.
Right.
Right? And reading through these historical accounts we have here, foreign nations absolutely started asking for their gold.
They did because, they can do the basic math. By the late 1960s, countries realized the sheer volume of dollars flooding the globe completely dwarfed the U.S. gold reserves.
Right, they saw the printing presses running hot.
Exactly. French President Charles de Gaulle was notoriously skeptical of this. He actually sent the French Navy across the Atlantic to physically retrieve French gold from the New York Federal Reserve.
He sent the Navy. That is such a wild flex.
It was, and other countries saw France doing this and started quietly lining up to redeem their dollars too. It was essentially a slow-motion global bank run.
So the trust in the paper receipt was just evaporating. Which leads us to the climax of this crisis on August 15th, 1971. President Richard Nixon interrupts Sunday evening television broadcasting.
Yeah, the famous Nixon shock.
In that address, Nixon directed his Secretary of the Treasury, John Connally, to temporarily suspend the convertibility of the dollar into gold. He essentially slammed the gold window shut.
He did. And, the word temporarily was just a political cushion. The window never reopened.
Never.
Oh.
So let's analyze the immediate mechanism of what happened the next morning when the markets opened. Because the dollar didn't just become unpegged from gold, it became what economists call a fiat currency.
Right, and the term fiat comes from Latin, meaning let it be done or it shall be.
Right.
It means the currency has value simply because the government declares it has value. In a single television address, the entire foundation of international monetary policy was permanently reshaped.
So the U.S. dollar went from being a hard asset receipt to being backed by absolutely nothing. Well, nothing other than trust in the ongoing stability and authority of the United States government.
Exactly. Just trust.
I mean, I'm looking at the timeline here, and the timing of that shift is just staggering. Backing your entire currency with trust is an incredibly dangerous bet when the rest of the world is right in the middle of realizing they shouldn't trust your accounting.
Yeah, the optics were terrible.
Well, you've just defaulted on the gold promise, and your follow-up pitch is, hey, just trust us.
It left the U.S. dollar incredibly vulnerable. The foundation of global finance had just been hollowed out overnight, and this severe structural richness is what paved the way for a catastrophic crisis just 2 years later.
Right.
Because just when the unbacked fiat dollar was at its absolute most fragile, the Middle East exploded.
October 1973, the outbreak of the Yom Kippur War. Egypt and Syria launch a surprise attack on Israel. The United States steps in to back Israel, initiating this massive military airlift of weapons and supplies called Operation Nickel Grass.
And that specific geopolitical decision triggered a ruthless economic retaliation.
Okay, what happened?
The Arab oil-producing nations, operating under the umbrella of OPEC, decided to deploy the one weapon the United States had absolutely no defense against.
Energy.
They slashed oil production drastically and instituted a total oil embargo against the United States.
The impact on the underlying economic mechanics was just devastating. I mean, we aren't just talking about an inconvenience at the gas pump for everyday people.
No, it was much deeper than that.
The price of a barrel of oil skyrocketed from roughly $3 to nearly $12 in a matter of months. That is a 400% price increase on the single most critical commodity that powers a modern industrial economy.
Yeah, and you really have to consider the systemic shock of that. Your factories, your logistics networks, your agricultural production, literally everything requires oil.
Right.
So when the price of your foundational energy source quadruples, the cost of every single downstream good explodes. Inflation just rips through the economy.
The U.S. was facing an absolute economic nightmare. Let's synthesize the exact vulnerabilities of the American system in that specific window of time.
Okay, let's list them out.
Number one, you have a brand new fiat currency with absolutely no physical backing. Number two, you are facing skyrocketing double-digit inflation. Number three, foreign powers are successfully using the world's most vital energy source to actively strangle your domestic economy.
Yeah, it was a perfect storm. The dollar was arguably on the verge of complete collapse.
So what do? Because you can't just slap a Band-Aid on that.
They realized they couldn't just patch the system. They needed a brand new, unbreakable anchor to replace gold.
Right.
They needed something that every single country on Earth required so desperately that foreign governments would have absolute no choice but to hold and use U.S. dollars, regardless of the inflation or the fiat status.
Enter Henry Kissinger, the U.S. Secretary of State, and William Simon, the Treasury Secretary. In 1974, they undertake a series of highly classified diplomatic missions to Saudi Arabia.
Yeah, and this is where the sheer geopolitical genius of the system really takes shape.
Okay, I want to role-play this a bit because we have to look at this from the Saudi perspective to understand why they agreed to this deal.
Sure.
In 1974, Saudi Arabia is suddenly realizing unprecedented, staggering wealth from that huge spike in oil prices we just talked about.
Mountains of cash.
But they have a massive vulnerability. They're sitting in the middle of a highly volatile region, surrounded by heavily armed neighbors and Soviet influence, and they possess very little military infrastructure of their own.
So they are essentially sitting on an ocean of wealth with a giant neon sign blinking, "Please invade me."
Exactly, please invade me. It was a severe existential security threat.
And Kissinger and Simon recognized this leverage immediately. They offered a monumental trade. The United States possessed the most powerful military apparatus on the planet, so they proposed a comprehensive security umbrella.
Let's lay out the exact terms of the trade, because this right here is the foundation of the modern world. The U.S. says to the Saudi royals, "We will sell you our most advanced military weapons. We will physically secure your oil fields.
We will ensure the survival of the House of Saud against any regional or global threats."
But in exchange, you must agree to two non-negotiable economic rules."
Right. Rule number 1. Saudi Arabia must agree to sell all of its oil exclusively in United States dollars. Not British pounds, not Japanese yen, not some basket of currencies, only dollars.
And rule number 2, which is just as critical, Saudi Arabia must take all those excess billions of dollars they're about to make and invest them directly into United States Treasury bonds.
It was an incredibly elegant solution to both nations' most pressing vulnerabilities. The Saudis received an ironclad guarantee of physical survival.
And the United States secured a permanent structural demand for its fiat currency.
Exactly. By 1975, seeing the incredible security guarantees provided to the Saudis, the rest of the OPEC nations fell in line. They all began pricing their global oil exports exclusively in U.S. dollars.
The petrodollar was officially born, the gold standard was dead, replaced by the oil standard.
Yeah.
But getting OPEC to slap a dollar sign on a barrel of crude was just the ignition switch, right? The engine itself, the mechanism that became the actual anchor for all of global finance, is what happens to those dollars after the oil is pumped out of the ground.
This is where we really need to dissect the actual plumbing of what economists call the petrodollar loop.
Okay, let's break this down into a simple step-by-step structure without all the dense jargon.
Sounds good. It's basically a 3-part cycle. Let's start with step 1, which we can call the creation of artificial demand.
So if you are an industrialized nation in the 1970s, say Japan or West Germany or France, you desperately need oil to keep your economy running.
Everybody does.
But because of the 1974 agreement, Saudi Arabia will not accept your yen, your marks, or your francs.
So mechanically, what does Japan have to do? A Japanese energy company cannot simply wire yen to Riyadh. They are forced to enter the international foreign exchange markets.
Right.
They must sell their native currency and purchase United States dollars. Only after they have acquired this huge stockpile of U.S. dollars can they approach the Saudis to purchase the physical oil.
So by enforcing that single rule, the United States guaranteed that every nation on Earth constantly required a massive underlying reserve of American paper just to keep their lights on.
Exactly. Japan wasn't holding dollars because they loved American fiscal policy. They were holding dollars because they wanted to buy oil from the Middle East.
That is wild. Okay, that brings us to step 2 of the loop, petrodollar recycling.
Right, so now we shift our perspective to the oil exporters. Nations like Saudi Arabia are suddenly the recipients of historic, monumental wealth transfers. Billions of U.S. dollars are flowing into their central banks from all over the world.
But they encounter a unique logistical problem, right?
They do. Their domestic economies are simply too small to absorb that much capital. They cannot build highways or hospitals or import consumer goods fast enough to actually spend the incoming cash.
So you have a foreign nation accumulating literal mountains of American currency. What do they do with it?
This is the genius of the second rule of Kissinger's deal. Those excess funds, the petrodollars, had to be deployed somewhere that offered safety, liquidity, and a yield.
Right.
And per the agreement, those dollars flowed directly back into the American financial system. The Saudis took their massive dollar surpluses and bought United States Treasury bonds.
They deposited funds into major American commercial banks, which then lent that money out to American businesses.
Exactly.
I really want to pause and trace the path of a single dollar bill here, because it's fascinating. A Japanese factory worker pays taxes in yen.
Okay.
The Japanese government converts that yen into dollars to buy Saudi oil. The Saudis take that exact same dollar and use it to buy a U.S. Treasury bond.
Yep.
Which means that dollar ends up right back in the hands of the United States government.
It's a perfect loop. Which brings us to step 3, funding the empire.
And this is where the loop directly benefits you, the listener, in ways that are rarely ever explained on the news.
Right, because the United States government is receiving an absolute tsunami of this recycled foreign capital. Because foreign nations are forced to buy U.S. Treasury bonds with their oil profits, the demand for American government debt remains artificially, permanently high.
Let's explain the mechanics of debt demand for a second. If I am trying to borrow money
Yeah.
and nobody wants to lend it to me, I have to offer a very high interest rate to entice them.
Obviously.
But if everyone on Earth is lining up to lend me money because they have to, I can drop the interest rate to the floor.
Exactly. This constant influx of recycled petrodollars allowed the United States government to finance massive deficit spending without suffering the typical economic consequences. Economists refer to this dynamic as America's exorbitant privilege.
Exorbitant privilege. I love that phrase. It's basically the ultimate global subsidy. Because the rest of the world was forced to constantly absorb our currency, the United States could print vast amounts of money.
Yeah, and in almost any other country, reckless money printing results in crippling domestic hyperinflation.
Right, but the United States could effectively export its inflation. We printed the money, handed it to foreign countries in exchange for tangible goods like cars and electronics, and those countries locked the money away in their central bank reserves so they could buy oil later.
It lowered borrowing costs for the American government, which then lowered mortgage rates and business loan rates for the everyday American citizen. By the 1980s, the dollar made up over 70% of global reserves.
That's incredible. And in a perfect self-sustaining loop, this cheap financing funded the very same military apparatus stationed in the Middle East, protecting the oil fields, ensuring the oil kept flowing, and keeping the petrodollar cycle spinning.
It's a brilliant piece of engineering. But the evolution didn't stop there. Over the decades, the dollar morphed from just being the specialized token used to buy oil into the foundational plumbing of all international commerce.
It evolved into a global financial utility because every central bank on Earth was forced to hold massive reserves of dollars for energy purchases anyway. It simply became more efficient to use those dollars for everything else.
Exactly. By the late 1990s, the vast majority of all cross-border trade, whether it was South Korea buying Brazilian soybeans or Australia buying German machinery, was invoiced and settled in U.S. dollars.
The best way to visualize this mechanism isn't even as a currency anymore. It's better to think of it as a digital network. The dollar became the financial internet.
That's a great analogy.
But let's dig into how that financial internet actually functions, because it introduces a concept called correspondent banking. If a bank in Chile wants to send $1 billion to a bank in Thailand, they don't physically fly pallets of cash across the Pacific Ocean.
No, the transaction is entirely digital, and it relies on a messaging network called SWIFT, the Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunication.
Right.
But SWIFT is just a secure messaging app. It doesn't actually move the money itself. To move the money, those foreign banks must hold accounts with major U.S. banks in New York, known as correspondent banks.
So when the Chilean bank hits send on the SWIFT network, a computer server in New York just updates a ledger. It deducts $1 billion from Chile's account and credits $1 billion to Thailand's account.
That ledger entry is the critical vulnerability for the rest of the world, because those correspondent banks operate under the jurisdiction of the United States government.
Which means the United States has the power to pull the plug.
Exactly. If Washington issues a sanction, they aren't just making a diplomatic statement. They are legally ordering those New York banks to refuse to clear any ledger entries involving the sanctioned country.
Getting sanctioned under this system is not like being banned from a specific trade route or a single website. It is the equivalent of someone walking into the server room and physically unplugging your entire nation's router from the global grid.
Your banks cannot communicate. You cannot clear export payments. You cannot pay for imports. Your modern economy is just paralyzed.
And obviously, foreign leaders recognized this vulnerability. They knew they were operating their entire national economies on rented server space controlled by Washington.
Right.
Which leads to a timeline of historical friction. And as we look at these historical events, I want to be extremely clear to you listening. We are examining this data strictly through the lens of international monetary policy and currency mechanics.
We have to remain completely impartial here.
Exactly. These historical conflicts involved incredibly complex webs of human rights abuses, drug trafficking, regional instability, and military aggression. We are not endorsing any viewpoints or implying a single cause for these wars. But the timeline regarding the currency is a recognizable pattern that we need to talk about.
The pattern is what we are analyzing today. Let's examine what happens mechanically when a nation attempts to openly bypass the dollar infrastructure. The first major modern attempt occurred in the year 2000 with Iraq.
Saddam Hussein makes a highly publicized announcement that Iraq will no longer accept U.S. dollars for its oil exports. Instead, under the UN Oil for Food program, he demands that all Iraqi oil sales be conducted and settled entirely in euros.
Right, and from a strictly economic standpoint, this was a direct assault on the fundamental rule of the 1974 Petrodollar framework.
By 2003, a U.S.-led coalition invaded Iraq. Following the fall of the regime, when Iraqi oil exports eventually resumed under new governance, the sales quietly reverted back to being priced and settled in U.S. dollars.
Then we move the timeline to Libya in 2011. Muammar Gaddafi begins advancing a proposal to create a unified Pan-African currency called the gold dinar.
And unlike fiat currencies, his plan was to back this new money with Libya's massive sovereign gold reserves. They held roughly 143 tons of physical gold.
The mechanical intent of the gold dinar was to completely dislodge the U.S. dollar from the African energy trade. It was a proposal to return to a hard asset trade settlement system completely outside of Western banking channels.
Later in 2011, amid the broader Arab Spring, a civil war erupted. NATO intervened militarily, Gaddafi was killed, and the institutional push for the gold dinar just evaporated.
And the most recent example, which is perhaps the most glaring regarding the sheer scale of energy involved, is Venezuela.
Venezuela possesses the single largest proven oil reserves on the planet, over 300 billion barrels. In 2018, facing crippling economic conditions, Nicolas Maduro attempts to completely circumvent the U.S. banking system by launching a sovereign cryptocurrency called the Petro.
The theoretical mechanism behind the Petro was to use blockchain technology to clear energy transactions without ever touching a correspondent bank in New York or the SWIFT messaging network.
Right.
In practice, though, the Petro suffered from massive liquidity issues and a total lack of trust, failing completely as a functional currency.
It failed as a currency, but the geopolitical act of attempting to route the world's largest oil reserves around the dollar system triggered an aggressive response.
It did. The United States dramatically escalated sanctions, effectively blocking Venezuelan oil from global markets.
This economic siege lasted for years, culminating in a military operation in January 2026, where U.S. forces successfully captured Maduro. Following the operation, President Trump announced initiatives to install U.S. corporate oversight to rebuild and manage Venezuela's energy infrastructure. The largest oil reserves on Earth were forcefully integrated back into the dollar-dominated market.
Again, it is so vital to acknowledge the deep political and humanitarian crises involved in each of these nations. But the underlying economic reality is that for 50 years, the petrodollar loop acted as a fortified walled garden.
And the historical friction of attempting to leave that garden served as a severe implicit warning to the rest of the world.
You do not try to unplug from the financial internet.
But, the flaw in every empire is the assumption that its leverage is absolute forever. And looking at the central bank data from 2022, the United States made a geopolitical calculation that fundamentally shattered the illusion of the dollar's neutrality.
You are referring to the financial response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine.
Yes.
In 2022, the United States and its European allies executed a maneuver that was unprecedented against an economy of that size. They didn't just sanction oligarchs, they actively froze the sovereign foreign exchange reserves of the Russian central bank. Nearly $300 billion.
Let's explain the mechanics of a freeze, because I think people misunderstand this. When we say Russia had $300 billion in reserves, they didn't have 300 billion paper bills sitting in a vault in Moscow.
Exactly the opposite. Those reserves were held in digital ledger entries at Western central banks and clearinghouses. So when the US and EU issued the freeze, they simply changed the permissions on the ledger. Overnight, decades of Russian national savings, generated from their own massive energy exports, were completely immobilized. Furthermore, major Russian financial institutions were formally severed from the SWIFT network.
I am reading reports from financial analysts regarding the immediate aftermath of this, and the consensus is that it was a profound miscalculation in the long term.
Oh, absolutely.
Yes, it was intended to economically cripple Russia. But the secondary effect was that it terrified every other central bank governor on the planet.
It triggered a massive, irreversible psychological shift regarding counterparty risk.
Explain counterparty risk.
So for decades, the U.S. Treasury bond was considered the ultimate risk-free asset. But when you freeze the sovereign savings of a G20 nation, Every other government, whether it is Brazil, India, Saudi Arabia, or China, looks at their own dollar reserves and realizes a chilling truth.
The fundamental realization hits them. This money is not actually ours.
Right. We only have access to this wealth for as long as the U.S. agrees it is ours and as long as our foreign policy aligns with Washington, D.C.
It proved that the financial internet could be and would be fully weaponized.
And central banks are notoriously risk-averse institutions.
Yeah.
They did not wait for the next geopolitical crisis to test that vulnerability. They initiated an immediate, aggressive diversification strategy.
And we saw a massive cascade of this diversification. The most prominent mover was China. Over the last decade, China has systematically dumped its holdings of United States Treasury bonds.
The numbers plummeted from a peak of over $1.3 trillion down to roughly $600 billion.
But they can't just hold cash, right? They still need a reserve asset. This brings us to a fascinating full-circle moment in our timeline. Because to protect themselves from the weaponized fiat dollar, central banks are flooding back into the exact asset Richard Nixon tried to abandon in 1971.
Physical gold.
The data on this is striking. Central banks globally have gone on an unprecedented gold hoarding spree. In 2024 alone, they added over 1,000 tons of physical gold to their sovereign vaults.
And the mechanism of why they are doing this is crucial to understand. We need to compare the stability of these systems.
Right. Explain the difference in counterparty risk between holding $1 billion in treasury bonds versus $1 billion in gold bullion.
A treasury bond is a promise. It's a trust-based fiat system. It requires the United States government to honor it, and as 2022 proved, that promise can be digitally frozen or turned off.
Okay, and gold.
Physical gold bullion sitting in a subterranean vault in Beijing or New Delhi possesses zero counterparty risk. It does not require a digital connection to New York. It does not require the SWIFT network to retain its value. It is tangible, borderless security that no foreign power can digitally turn off.
So central banks are securing their savings in gold. But gold is heavy and slow. You can't easily use it to buy daily shipments of electronics or soybeans. Countries still need to conduct cross-border trade.
Right, the gold just sits there as a foundational reserve.
And if they are trying to minimize their reliance on the dollar for everyday trade, they have to build new plumbing.
This is where we see the emergence of a highly fragmented, localized financial architecture. There is no single fiat currency. Not the euro, not the yen, and certainly not the Chinese yuan that possesses the deep liquidity, the open capital markets, and the universal trust required to replace the dollar wholesale.
So rather than one giant competitor stepping into the ring, we are seeing the rise of 1,000 small challengers. And looking at the trade data, the friction involved in this is massive, but countries are doing it anyway. Let's look at the mechanics of these new bilateral trades.
We are seeing an explosion of local currency settlement agreements. Russia and China are increasingly conducting their massive energy and manufacturing trade directly in Russian rubles and Chinese yuan.
Brazil and China recently struck agreements to settle their agricultural trade, bypassing the dollar. India has purchased millions of barrels of Russian oil and paid for it using Indian rupees.
But let me push back on that, because holding rupees if you are Russia seems like a terrible idea.
Why?
If Russia sells oil to India and gets billions of rupees, they can only really use those rupees to buy things from India. And if India doesn't produce the high-tech goods Russia needs, Russia is stuck in a liquidity trap. They have a bunch of currency they can't spend anywhere else.
I see. You are identifying the exact structural friction of de-dollarization. It is incredibly clunky. It involves exchange rate volatility, capital control restrictions, and trade imbalances.
Yeah, it's not nearly as smooth as using dollars.
But the geopolitical reality is that these nations are actively choosing to endure that deep economic friction because they view financial sovereignty as more valuable than the frictionless convenience of the U.S. dollar system.
And the most symbolic fracture in this entire system comes right back to the desert in 1974.
Saudi Arabia.
Saudi Arabia, the original architect of the Petrodollar deal. The country that promised Kissinger they would only ever accept dollars. They have now publicly stated they are open to settling energy trades in non-dollar currencies.
The foundational rule of the loop has been breached.
The mathematical erosion is actually visible in the global reserve data. In 2001, the U.S. dollar accounted for roughly 72% of all global central bank reserves. Today, that dominance has bled down to under 58%.
Meanwhile, the Chinese yuan, which was at virtually 0% of global reserves a decade ago, has climbed to roughly 2%.
2% sounds insignificant, I know, but in a multi-trillion-dollar ocean, it represents hundreds of billions of dollars routing completely around New York.
I have a quote here in my notes that I think summarizes this strategy perfectly. Ape alone weak, apes together strong.
Exactly.
No single currency, not the yuan or the euro or crypto, is big enough to fight the dollar alone. But a massive web of bilateral trades bypassing the SWIFT network acts as 1,000 tiny cuts, bleeding the system's absolute dominance.
However, if we step back and look at the macro picture, all of these geopolitical maneuvers, the sanctions, the gold hoarding, the bilateral trades, might ultimately be secondary to a much larger structural threat.
Well, this is the part I've been waiting for.
And this existential threat has absolutely nothing to do with central bank policy. It has to do with the technology sitting in everyday driveways.
Right. This is the data point that completely recontextualizes the whole conversation. Because the entire petrodollar loop, we just spent an hour breaking down the artificial demand for dollars. The recycling of wealth into treasury bonds is entirely predicated on one absolute truth.
That the global economy will always possess an insatiable, increasing demand for crude oil.
Which brings us to the intersection of international finance and the green energy transition. Let's look at the automotive market data for 2025. Globally, 1 in every 4 new cars sold is an electric vehicle.
25% of the new vehicle market.
And the adoption curve is aggressively steepening. Let's run the math on how a battery in a car directly attacks the United States Treasury. It is a direct mathematical correlation.
It's a domino effect. If the world transitions to green energy, solar grids, wind farms, and electric transport, nations become fundamentally less reliant on importing foreign oil.
And if they are importing less foreign oil, step 1 of the petrodollar loop mechanically weakens. Japan, Germany, and India no longer need to acquire such massive stockpiles of US dollars to secure their energy needs. The artificial, forced demand for the currency drops.
Which triggers the collapse of step 2. If global oil demand flattens or declines, the massive wealth transfers to nations like Saudi Arabia begin to dry up. They are no longer generating trillions of dollars in excess capital.
And if the oil exporters do not have mountains of excess petrodollars, they are no longer blindly recycling that wealth back into the United States financial system. The automatic, guaranteed international buyer for U.S. Treasury bonds disappears.
This is where it hits you, the listener, directly. Because if the United States government is still running massive multi-trillion-dollar deficits, but foreign central banks are no longer forced to buy our debt to fund those deficits, what happens to the interest rates?
Basic supply and demand dictates that if the demand for U.S. debt drops, the Treasury must make those bonds more attractive to find buyers. And the only mechanism to do that is to raise interest rates significantly.
And when the government rate goes up, the floor for everything else goes up. That means mortgage rates for the average citizen skyrocket.
The cost of borrowing for small businesses becomes suffocating. Credit card rates explode.
The exorbitant privilege that allowed America to borrow cheaply and export its inflation just vanishes.
If the world doesn't need to hold our dollars, all that printed money stays trapped inside the domestic economy, driving up the cost of everyday goods for ordinary citizens.
It represents a potential unwinding of the core macroeconomic advantage the United States has enjoyed for half a century.
Wow.
Now, to provide a grounded analytical reality check based on our sources, because we don't want to sound overly alarmist, a catastrophic overnight collapse of the US dollar is not supported by the current data. The petrodollar machine is still running.
Right, we aren't saying the dollar goes to zero next week. The data clearly shows the U.S. dollar still dominates 88% of all global foreign exchange transactions. It's still used in roughly half of all global trade invoicing.
You can't just untangle a 50-year-old financial internet overnight.
You can't. It will not be an overnight collapse. It will be a slow generational fragmentation. We are witnessing the gradual transition from a unipolar financial world where all roads lead to New York to a multipolar system where value moves through various regional networks and hard assets.
Exactly. So let's recap the mechanics of this journey we've been on.
We started with the mathematical impossibility of the Bretton Woods system, leading a desperate President Nixon to close the gold window in 1971 and plunge the world into a trust-based fiat experiment.
We explored the geopolitical masterstroke of 1974, where Kissinger and Simon traded military security for an absolute monopoly on oil pricing, creating the petrodollar loop.
We dissected how that loop subsidized American deficit spending through petrodollar recycling, and how the dollar evolved into a weaponized financial internet enforced through correspondent banking.
We tracked the historical friction points from Iraq to Venezuela, and analyzed the 2022 freeze of Russian assets that shattered global trust, igniting a massive flight by central banks into physical gold and clunky bilateral local currencies.
And finally, we examine the technological threat of the electric vehicle, which threatens to slowly starve the artificial demand loop of its foundational commodity.
It is a profound, ongoing evolution of global power.
I want to leave you, the listener, with a final concept to mull over. For the last 50 years, the fundamental strength of the money sitting in your pocket, the ability of your government to borrow cheaply, and the stability of your everyday purchasing power has been secretly anchored to the world's absolute addiction to burning fossil fuels.
As the globe races forward, pouring trillions of dollars into green energy, electric vehicles, and decentralized power grids in a desperate attempt to save the environmental ecosystem, it raises a really fascinating economic paradox.
Could that very same green revolution accidentally unplug the financial superpower of the United States?
It is definitely a mechanism worth considering the next time you see an EV silently drive past.
Absolutely. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.
That shift. If you enjoyed this, please remember to like this video,
Share it with your friends and subscribe to our channel.